Hi.
Hello, Emily.
How you doing?
Roman.
Hi, Jamie.
Welcome to the Live Lab. I can give you a little bit of a tour. One of the things that we do in the Live Lab that is so unique, we want to know what's happening inside people when they're musicians, when they're playing, and how audiences react. So we'll put EEG caps on audience members and on performers, and motion capture, which is what we're going to do with you today, and study in detail what's happening in people's brains and in their body movements to figure out how do you communicate with each other.
We should be able to swing that around.
It still works.
So I'm going to put these small markers on your body, on your joints, and then we can later just use computer to connect those dots as a line, so you have the skeleton.
All right, want to give me a smile? And relax. Now frown for me. That's good. Now surprise. Good. Okay, they're all staying. That's good.
Great.
That's good. Okay, I think we're ready to go.
Okay, so you're going to be playing some happy and some sad, because emotion has two main dimensions. So one is positive, negative, but the other is sort of how active it is or how calm it is.
Okay, good.
and gentlemen. I'm mezzo-soprano Julie Nasralla and host of Tempo on CBC Radio 2. Welcome and thank you all for coming. This evening will not only be full of wonderful music, it will also be full of exciting scientific ideas about how and why you experience music the way you do. You will look at the neurology behind your experience of music and even explore the idea that it is fundamental to making us human. I hope you enjoyed the Griffin Trio's opening piece. But why did you enjoy it? Well, one possible answer is that it's a marvelous work performed by masterful musicians. However, there is another way of looking at it. You all sat here for 5 minutes listening to a collection of sounds of different timbres being played at varying pitches, organized around a particular rhythm. But there are no words. There were no pictures. There are no symbols at all that you would normally use for conveying meaning. Yet those sounds gave you pleasure. In fact, music goes further than just giving pleasure. It can invoke images and sensations and deep emotions, such as sadness, joy, and awe. How and why does this happen? I remember the thrill I had the first time I heard Beethoven's Fifth Symphony during the transition from the third to the fourth movement. It's very dramatic. I heard it while on a school trip to see the movie Fame in the theater. And I remember feeling overwhelmed with a surge of excitement and wonder and magic. Beethoven was rocking my little soul, and I looked around the dark theater to see if any of the other kids were wide-eyed and filled with, "Oh my God, did that just rock your world too?" Well, if the other kids were loving it, they didn't show it. So I kept my passion for Beethoven to myself, and it's a passion that has grown strong for me over the years. I have the exact same passion for Van Morrison. A couple of years ago, I flew to Belfast alone to hear him play an exclusive concert for 200 people. There's just something about the sound of his voice that feels like home to me, and I don't know why. Every human society that we have ever known has had some sort of music, and the evidence for music extends as long ago as 35,000 years, the approximate age of ancient bone flutes discovered by archaeologists. Charles Darwin himself, the father of evolutionary theory, puzzled over why humans should have a capacity for music. He suggested music might have developed as a courtship ritual, and that singing actually led to language. Other scientists think that our musical ability began with the need to pay attention to natural rhythms, or that it helped us survive by strengthening social bonds. Tonight, you'll hear from two leading scientists about their research into the neural underpinnings of the brain's response to music. They will be aided by the great Griffin Trio and by you. You all received clickers upon entering the hall this evening. The clickers are very easy to use. You press the number or the letter on the clicker that corresponds to your choice on the screen. This is an excellent time to also request that you turn off your phone and any handheld device. So for the questions with multiple answers, you can press or change your response as many times as you want. It will only record your last vote. The researchers we'll hear from tonight are with the Azrieli program in Brain, Mind, and Consciousness at CIFAR, the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research. CIFAR is a Canadian research institution that brings together the best researchers from around the globe to work on complex questions of importance to the world. The Azrieli program in Brain, Mind, and Consciousness is bringing the best minds together to explore questions of consciousness and the brain. Earlier tonight, CIFAR announced that the Azrieli Foundation has given the extraordinarily generous gift of $10 million to make the program possible. On behalf of CIFAR, please join me in thanking the Azrieli Foundation for this visionary gift. Now, It's my pleasure to introduce Laurel Trainor. Laurel is a cognitive neuroscientist and a senior fellow with CIFAR's Azrieli program in brain, mind, and consciousness. She is the director of the Live Lab at McMaster University. You saw the Live Lab in the opening sequence, where members of the Griffin Trio were hooked up to motion sensors, analyzing their movement to music. Laurel is an accomplished flute player herself, and she has devoted her career to understanding the role of music in development of cognition, perception, communication, and emotion. She will talk about the deep connections between music and our sense of movement and community, even at the earliest stages in life. Please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Trainor.
So, thank you, Julie. Can you hear me, by the way? Thought I'd get that over with at the beginning. No? Okay, can you hear me now? Yes, no? Okay. So, it's wonderful to be here tonight with all of you. And I wanted to thank CIFAR, the Azrieli Foundation, Michael Kerner, and the Royal Conservatory for their support in this. And of course, it's been a pleasure to work with the Griffin Trio in putting this together. Did you know that the average person spends about 13 years of their life just listening to music? Music is found in every known human culture, past and present. It has a long history going back at least 30,000 years. And today, we spend a lot of time and money on music. In fact, the US makes more money exporting music than pharmaceuticals. Music has this incredible ability to move us emotionally. It can uplift us with joy, and it can make us weep. Around the world, parents sing to their infants while they hold them and rock them. One interesting thing about music is that it's usually a social activity. We make and listen to music with other people. And whether it's musicians playing in an orchestra, people singing in church, an audience clapping or dancing to a band. And even in the modern world, when we can listen to recorded music alone by ourselves, we still feel connected with the musicians who created that music and with other people that we know also listen to that music. Now, because we make music together, we have to coordinate. Now, when you talk to someone, you have a conversation, usually you take turns. But in music, we have to play at the same time. So these musicians, for example, need to move their bows at the same time, which means that to play together, their brains have to anticipate ahead of time what to play. And they have to anticipate exactly when to play it so that they are together. They also need to coordinate their emotional expression so they communicate with their audience. If they wait to hear what the other musicians play, it's too late. In a way, we do the same thing when we move or dance to music. We need to predict when the next beat is coming so that we get our foot or other body part in the right place at the right time. It's interesting that for the most part, your brain does all this prediction and coordination without conscious awareness. In fact, it can seem to be effortless. So along with my students, Andrew Chang, Haley Cragness, and Stephen Livingston, we were interested in how musicians move in order to communicate during a musical performance. So as you saw in the opening video, we brought the Griffin Trio into the Live Lab at McMaster University. So the Live Lab is a very unique space. It's a beautiful concert hall, but at the same time, it's a research lab. It has an active acoustic system with 28 microphones and 76 loudspeakers, and it can reproduce the acoustics of a cathedral, a subway station, or a fine concert hall. In the Live Lab, we can measure heartbeats and brain waves, or EEG, in multiple musicians and audience members during actual performances. At the top of the slide here, you see an EEG cap being placed on an audience member, and I'm going to talk a little bit later about some of our studies with EEG. We can also measure how people move in great detail using our motion capture system. As you saw in the video, we placed reflective markers on Roman, Annalee, and Jamie. As they played, our 24 special infrared cameras recorded the positions of these markers. And from this information, we constructed three-dimensional models of their movements. So let's look a little bit more detail at these movements. So Jamie here, this is Jamie, at the top, just shown by these point light markers. To play the piano, all he needs to do really is move his fingers at the right time, push the keys at the right time. And similarly, Annalee here and Roman here, all they need to do is pull their bow across the strings at the right time, coordinated, of course, with their left hand fingering. Now, this in itself is a very complex feat and takes years of practice. But to do this, they don't have to move the rest of their bodies. But they do move their heads, and they do sway their bodies when they play. So we measured and analyzed these movements to see if they used them to communicate emotion with each other. So the question was, did they use movements to convey a common emotional expression? So that they were not just three musicians playing at the same time, but they were communicating the meaning of the music. So now I'm actually going to play for you the video of them playing O Tono Porteno by Astor Piazzolla. And these points here, you probably can tell, oops, these points here well, the video's playing, and these are their heads, these are their shoulders and their arms, this is the violin, and this is the cello. So you see, you can get quite a bit of information just from their movements. Next, I'm going to play you two videos. We asked them to play, during their trip to the Live Lab, the same piece twice. So in one version, we asked them to play without musical expression, so that is, without emotion. And in the other version, we asked them to play expressively, conveying the emotion of the piece, whatever it was. I'm now going to show you these two videos of the point light displays. I've taken out, as you can see, I've taken out their lower arms and their hands and their instruments, so that really all you can see now is their head movements and their body sway. Now, both of these versions, the expressive version and the non-expressive version, will play at the same time. And I want you to see whether you think version A at the top or version B at the bottom is the version in which they were playing expressively to communicate the emotion. Just give you a heads up, you might want to look at Roman here. The first time I met Roman, he told me he wears his emotion on his sleeve, so he might move more than the others. But also look at Jamie's head movements. They're quite interesting. And look at the way Annalee sways her body. Now, after you watch these, we're going to ask you to actually tell us which one is the piece in which they were playing expressively. Okay, so now it's time to take out those clickers that you were given when you entered the auditorium. And if you think the expressive version was the top one, press A on your clicker. If you think the expressive version was the bottom one, press B on your clicker. And I'll just give you, have you all got your clickers out? I'll just give you a few seconds to make your responses. Okay, so let's see how you responded. Whoa, you guys are good. So you see, without even hearing the music, you can tell how expressively they're playing just from their body movements. Okay, now I'm going to play you 2 more videos, and this time we asked them to play some pieces that expressed a happy emotion and some pieces that expressed a sad emotion. And I want you to decide, is the top one or the bottom one playing the happy emotion? Okay, here we go. Okay, get your clickers out. If you think the top one was the happy one, press A. If you think the bottom one was the happy one, press B. And I'll just give you a few seconds. Okay, let's see these results. Whoa, exactly the same. I don't know what that means. Yeah. So the important thing here is that it was pretty easy for you to tell just from their movements without any sound when they were playing a happy piece and when they were playing a sad piece. Now I trust that I have made you anticipate how these pieces actually sound for long enough. So now we have the treat of actually hearing the Griffin Trio play these 2 pieces. Yeah, so isn't it wonderful to both hear and see music being played? So the next question we asked about their movements was, when they play expressively, and are they actually communicating better with each other than when they play non-expressively? So we analyzed this using a technique called Granger Causality. So represented here on the x-axis is time, and represented here on the y-axis is the body sway of musician 1 and the body sway of musician 2. Now here's the key with Granger Causality. If we take a particular point in time, say here, what we want to know is, can we predict the movements of musician 2 from the prior movements of musician 1, over and above any prediction we can do within a musician? If we can, if the movements of musician 1 here predict how musician 2 is going to move here, then that tells us that they are communicating through their movements. We can look at how much each musician's body sway affects or predicts each other musician's body sway. So for example, how well does the violinist predict the movements of the cellist? How well does the cellist predict the movements of the violinist? And we can take the sum of all 6 of these relationships, and this tells us how well the musicians are communicating as a group. And we call this group coupling. So here, we look at, we compare the expressive and the non-expressive performances of these pieces. And here we did it for all the happy pieces, and you can see that the expressive pieces in yellow have greater group coupling than the non-expressive pieces that are shown in white. Same thing is true for the sad pieces. Again, you see that the group coupling was higher when they played expressively than when they played non-expressively. So these results tell us that body sway is actually helping them to communicate emotional information to each other about how to play the piece, and it's affecting how the piece unfolds in time. So body movements communicate emotion. When the trio played, did you find yourself tapping your foot or moving to the music? Or at least you might have felt an urge to do that. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit more about why rhythms are so powerful and how the brain processes rhythms. Rhythms occur in music, of course, but they occur in many biological systems. So we walk rhythmically, speech has a rhythm, our heartbeats are rhythmic. One of the most important things about rhythms is that they are predictable. When the notes are spaced evenly in time, like this, you can predict with very high accuracy when the next beat is going to occur. So rhythms are incredibly useful because knowing when something is going to occur allows you to focus your attention at that point in time. And this allows you to be prepared for what is going to happen at that point in time. In fact, we can think about the brain as an organ that is always trying to predict the future. Through evolution, this was incredibly important. To survive, for example, you needed to be able to predict what direction a lion was going to go in and when it would reach you to make sure that you would not be at that place at that time. Now, today, if you are a team sports player, it isn't enough to know where the other players are now. You need to know where they're going to be a few moments from now so that you will be in the right place at the right time. This is Russell Westbrook. He plays now for Oklahoma City, and he's one of the main reasons why they did so well this year. Here he is when he was playing college basketball for UCLA. His teammate here has the ball. He is trying to pass the ball to someone who can get closer to the net. So he might predict that Russell is going to move in here, and Russell might predict that if he starts moving here, he will throw him the ball. If this guy on the other team doesn't also predict that, he's going to get scored on. So to play basketball, you need to be able to dribble and pass and shoot, but one of the most important things is to be able to predict where the other players are going to be and be in the right place at the right time. Music makes use of our ability to predict the future. Rhythms in music, shown by the musical notes in yellow here, set up expectations that the most important notes are going to occur on strong beats. And our attention goes up and down with the rhythm of the music. So, for example, if musicians, God forbid, played a wrong note, you would be much better able to detect that if the wrong note was on a strong beat than if the wrong note was played on a weak beat. And the quartet is just going to illustrate this for us. They're going to play a little excerpt from Haydn and see if you hear a wrong note in what they play. Okay, I think you heard that. They're now going to play a wrong note, but it's not going to be on a strong beat. Did you hear that? Very subtle, yeah. So this waxing and waning of attention that's set up by rhythms is very important. Now, how does our brain do this? Well, neurons in the brain communicate with each other through electrical signals. When a group of neurons depolarize and fire together, they create an electrical field that we can measure at the surface of the head. And this is called the electroencephalogram, or EEG. Now, we can take a recording of EEG, like the one that's shown here, and we can use Fourier analysis to decompose it into a series of oscillations. So you see slow oscillations here, or low frequency oscillations, medium ones here, and fast or high frequency oscillations here. And these different oscillations actually reflect very important brain processes. So what does this have to do with rhythm? Well, in our research, we've shown that when a person listens to a musical beat, some of these brain oscillations entrain or synchronize to the beat. So the brain is a bit like a resonator. The neural oscillations in your brain line up with the rhythm of the musical input. So what you see here are actual brain responses to a series of equally spaced beats. And these were measured by Takako Fujioka, who was my postdoc at the time. So the musical beats are shown here. This is what the person actually heard. And you can see they're evenly spaced in time. The x-axis represents time. And on the y-axis, we have low frequencies here going up to higher frequencies here. Now, the colors represent energy. So red represents a lot of energy, and blue represents very low energy. And so what you can see is that after a beat, if we look at these middle frequencies here around 20 hertz, after a beat, there's a decrease in energy, decrease in this oscillation, and then it rebounds so that it reaches a maximum at the time of the next beat. And then we get another decrease after that beat, and again it rebounds so it reaches a maximum at the time of the next beat. This is the brain predicting when the next beat is going to occur. If we slow down the tempo, so now you see these beats are spaced further in time, the brain responses also slow down. So we still get the decrease and increase, but it's now entrained to this slower tempo. So this is the brain predicting when the next beat will occur. And this is what the brains of musicians are doing when they are playing. It's what enables them to play together. And this is also what your brain is doing when you listen to music. Your brain entrains to the beat. Even when you're just listening and you're not playing music and you're not even moving, your brain is predicting when the next beat is going to occur. Now, it's interesting that this anticipation or prediction of the beat occurs in your brain without you even being aware of it. You're not conscious of it. And remember this because in the second half, Robert is going to talk about how these expectations actually affect your emotional responses to music. Now, we can actually look across the whole brain, and we can look at which areas of the brain show this entrainment to the beat. Well, not too surprisingly, we see it in auditory cortex, and that's the part of the brain that processes sound. But we also see it in the supplementary motor area and in the cerebellum. These are parts of the brain that have to do with movement, nothing to do really with hearing. But this is why, when you listen to music with a beat, you feel an urge to move, whether tapping your toe or breakdancing. Even if you don't actually move, the motor circuits in your brain are preparing you to move to the beat. So again, we see this very powerful connection between auditory rhythms and movements. Now, movements are very important in another way. Musical rhythms set up social dynamics. If two or more people listen to the same music and they all move to that music, they're going to move at the same tempo. This has important social consequences because when two people move in synchrony, afterwards, they feel more socially affiliated. Have you ever wondered why we have music at virtually every occasion when we want to feel common emotion with others? We have music at weddings to feel joy together. We have music at funerals to feel grief together. We have music at religious ceremonies and at parties. We have music and rhythmic chants at sporting events to feel one with other fans. And we have music in the military to promote solidarity. So experiments have found, for example, that if two adults move in synchrony with each other, afterwards they cooperate more with each other, they trust each other more, and they like each other more in comparison to people who move out of sync with each other. Again, for the most part, we're not consciously aware that synchronous movement has these effects on us, but they can be quite powerful. So how early in development can we see prosocial effects of movement synchronization? Well, to anticipate, the answer is we can see them very early. Now, the motor system of infants is very immature at birth. It takes months before an infant can even sit up or roll over. So for the most part, infants are not able to precisely move in time to a beat. So, to test whether synchronous movements with another person affect their social behavior, another graduate student of mine, Laura Sorelli, and I decided that we would move infants. So specifically, we bounced them. Here is our experimental setup. This is a 14-month-old infant, and this assistant here is holding the infant, and the infant is listening to Twist and Shout by the Beatles, and this assistant is the bouncer. So she bounces up and down and bounces the infant up and down in time to the music. This is the experimenter. She faces the infant, and she bounces according to whatever she hears over her headphones. And sometimes her beat track makes her in sync with an infant, but for another infant, she might be out of sync with that infant and bounce either too fast or too slow. After this experience, we then see how willing these infants are to help this experimenter that they either bounced in sync with or out of sync with. So, in this first video, you will see an infant being bounced in sync with the experimenter. So, let's take a look. Yeah. Catchy tune, you can't help playing along. So in this second video, you're now going to see whether that infant who bounced in sync with the experimenter helped the experimenter in our tasks.
I'm going to put it right there. Oh, no. Oopsie. Uh-oh. Oh, no. There.
Okay, in this next video, you're going to see an infant bounced out of sync with the experimenter. And now see whether this infant helps the experimenter.
There. Uh-oh. Oh, no. Oopsie.
Interesting. So what we learned was that those infants who were bounced in sync with the experimenter for just 2.5 minutes helped her much more than those infants who were bounced out of sync. The power of music. So in a second study, we examined whether infants who were bounced in sync with one person would help a stranger who just sat here and didn't bounce with them. And the answer was no, they didn't. Infants don't help strangers who don't bounce with them. But in another condition, the infant bounced still with just the one experimenter, but the infants also saw a skit where this experimenter interacted with this stranger so that it was clear that they were friends. And in this case, the infants did help friends of in-sync bouncers. So this is pretty sophisticated. Infants are using their knowledge of social relationships and using cues of music to decide on their social behavior. So around the world, caregivers sing to infants and rock them to sleep and bounce them to play with them. We now know that infants use rhythm as a powerful cue to navigate their social world and decide who to trust and who to befriend. So let me sum up. Music makes us feel emotions. Much of the power of music to move us results from the predictions that music sets up. These predictions enable us to move in time to music and to play in sync with other people. And moving together can strengthen bonds and increase cooperation and altruistic behavior. So these research findings also have important clinical applications. For example, music can be used to help mothers with postpartum depression to bond with their infants. Training with musical rhythms can help children with dyslexia. And moving to music can help Parkinson's patients to walk. And now we will end the first half with you having the privilege of feeling the rhythm and feeling the emotion and perhaps feeling some affiliation with your neighbors while the Griffin Trio plays the second movement of Lalo's Piano Trio No. 3.
Leben zu dir, meiner unsterblich Geliebte. Hier und da freu dich, dann wieder traurig. Leben kann ich entweder nur ganz mit dir oder gar nicht. Meine Seele von dir umgeben, ins Reich der Geister kann mein Herz besetzen. O Leben mich, verkenne nie das treueste Herz deines Geliebten. Warum sich entfernen müssen, was man so lebt? Deine Liebe macht mich zum unglücklichsten
Thank you all so very much. I really love performing that piece. It's by Canadian composer James Wright, and it's based on the letters Beethoven wrote to the person he called his immortal beloved. So think for a moment about how the music made you feel. Sad, happy, melancholy, joyous. Robert Zatorre is going to talk now about how music brings about these emotions. Robert is a senior fellow in the Azrieli program in Brain, Mind, and Consciousness at CIFAR, a cognitive neuroscientist at McGill University, and founding co-director of the International Laboratory for Brain, Music, and Sound Research. His research focuses on brain function and structure with a special interest in music and speech. Today, he will talk to you about the complex neurology behind our experience of music and how it gives rise to pleasure and emotion. Interestingly enough, he too is a trained musician who studied as an organist. So please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Zatorre.
Thank you very much, Julie. Thank you all for being here this wonderful evening and with this wonderful trio before us. And I want to be sure to acknowledge the fact that this whole show was set up by the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research with the support of the Azrieli Foundation. And the program, in fact, is focused on the brain and consciousness. And it's a little broader than that as well. It really focuses on some very complex and poorly understood functions, the highest sort of cognitive functions that we humans are capable of. And sometimes people ask me, well, why do you study something like music? What's the point of that? And there are many answers to that, but I sometimes point them to this statement, which is literally carved in stone on the front of our institute on University Street in Montreal, or it's actually coulé en béton, because it's actually concrete, I think, not stone. And Wilder Penfield, who was the founder of our institute, basically said that what neuroscience is all about is trying to understand what it is to be human. How is it that the brain allows all of the functions that we have that make us human? And I think in that context, understanding complex phenomena like consciousness, like music, like aesthetics, I think is essential, because I would argue that without those things, we wouldn't be human. So Julia earlier alluded to the origin of music, and she mentioned that it was sort of a puzzle for Darwin as to why we even have it. And indeed, he at some point sort of threw up his hands and said, well, it's one of the most mysterious faculties with which we are endowed. And he didn't really have a very good idea of what it was all about. But in the latter part of his life, he reflected on various aspects of his life. And he had this to say in his autobiography. He said, if I had to live my life again, I would have made a rule to listen to some music at least once every week, for perhaps the parts of my brain now atrophied would have been kept active through use. So this is sage advice from a sage man. And then he went on to point out that without music, there's a loss of the moral character, and there's a weakness of emotions. And so indeed, even though in his sort of theoretical understanding he didn't have a good response about music, in his own sort of personal understanding he did. He had a very profound understanding that music is really about communicating, expressing emotion and feeling, and that it also sort of keeps our brains healthy. So we're going to try to probe into this brain that allows us to produce and understand and perceive music. And this diagram is from a paper, actually, we wrote with one of my former students, Joyce Chen, who's now a scientist here at Sunnybrook, and Virginia Penhune. And what we were trying to do is point out that the brain not only has to perceive music, it also has to produce music, because if no one produces music, you can't perceive it, right? So it's kind of a loop, because the brain controls the motor actions of the muscles that allow you to produce music, but at the same time, those motor actions produce sounds which influence subsequent motor actions. So it's very much a loop in that respect. And it's a very complex system, of course. I'm only giving you kind of a caricature of it this evening. But here's a sort of a close-up. And don't worry, there won't be an exam at the end where you have to remember the nomenclature. But I do want to call your attention to this area in the temporal lobe here, the auditory cortex, because that's where impulses come in through the ear and then go through the brainstem and end up in the cortex there. And then there are a series of cortical circuits, which are quite complex, that interconnect the auditory areas with regions that have to do with motor control, in particular the premotor regions, and areas of the prefrontal cortex. And I'll come back to this idea that these circuits are essential in enabling many of the functions that are the reason why we're able to both produce and perceive music. Now, we want to probe inside the brains of musicians. How do we do that? There are various ways. Laurel illustrated some very elegant studies using EEG, which allows you to look at temporally unfolding events with great precision. We, in our lab at the Montreal Neurological Institute, have used various techniques, but in particular magnetic resonance imaging, because that allows us to pinpoint the location of brain areas that are active during particular tasks that are of interest. And one such function of interest is the performance of music. And so in order to understand the performance of music, you actually have to get people to play music inside an MRI scanner. And I don't know how many of you have been inside an MRI scanner, but it's rather confined. However, we have been able to work with some music technology engineers to build us some instruments. And if we can go to the video, this will illustrate.
The basic idea behind what we're trying to do is to use music in a global way to understand brain function.
I look at what happens in the brain when cello players are playing the cello, which is exciting to me because I am a cello player and a neuroscientist. Playing the cello inside of the MRI is definitely very different than playing the cello outside of the MRI. For starters, you have to be lying down, which is a non-standard position for a cellist to be in. There are also the constraints inherent in the instrument itself, being that it doesn't actually have a resonant body, so you don't get the vibration feedback that you're used to getting from your instrument. It's also equipped with gut strings, which are a very different feeling than the metal strings. They're much harder to get sound out of.
So in this experiment, for the first time, we're looking at how the brain of a highly trained musician, specifically a cellist, is working when they're playing their instrument.
So this is a very cool device that was actually built for us by Avram Hollinger, who is another person who's somehow ended up in Toronto. I don't know why they all come here. So Avram built this device which allows us to actually look at brain activity of a professional cellist when they're doing their thing. And what we see when we look at this pattern here, so this is showing you the green areas are areas that are more active during the performance of the instrument than during other conditions. And we see indeed some of the same circuitry that was shown here. And I hasten to add that this paper was published in 2007, and this result was obtained only a couple of months ago. So, we weren't sort of faking it. And the areas involved are, of course, the auditory cortex, and over here in the parietal lobe, and this frontal cortical area. And part of what this shows us, with some analysis of the interrelationship between those regions, is that these regions are working together as a sort of a unit, because when you're playing the instrument, you not only have to produce the sound, but you have to adjust the position and the pressure of your motor action in order to get just the right pitch. So the auditory and motor systems are in constant interaction under those kinds of conditions. Now, in order to be able to play an instrument, if you take highly trained musicians like we have on stage here, you have to undergo many, many years of practice and training. And another feature that we've been trying to understand is how the brain changes as a consequence of all that training. So one nice thing about MRI is that we can not only look at brain activity, so as we're looking at there with functional magnetic resonance image, but we can also look at brain anatomy. So here are some images of the amount of cortical thickness that is different between people with musical training and people without. This is some work done by Patrick Bermudez, who actually was in Toronto but came back to Montreal, so he's in our good books. And what Patrick discovered is that there are areas of greater cortical thickness, so the actual amount of gray matter in the brain is greater in the auditory areas, here in the right and in the left hemisphere, as well as in the motor cortex, and also in the frontal cortex. So we interpret this as evidence that there's a certain degree of plasticity, meaning that the brain of a musician has adapted to be able to do what they do so well. And indeed, the regions that are involved are many of the same ones that I've just shown you are involved in the playing of the instrument. Now, another very important feature is not only the amount of practice that you have, but also the age at which you begin to train. And not only in the case of music, but in many other domains as well, sports and vision and so forth, it is shown that the early training is more important because the early development of the brain has more plasticity than later on in life. And actually, I'm just wondering, for our musicians, I'd like to know what ages they started their musical training. So how old were you when you first started taking lessons? 3. And Jamie?
I was 5.
5. And Ronan?
6.
6. So you were just on the edge there. Now, I started training as an organist when I was 13, and this is why these guys are on stage playing, and I'm giving a lecture. And we know that these factors play an important role, because if we look at the, again, the anatomy of the brain as a function of the age at which training began, and this is controlling for the total number of years of training, so it's just about the age at which training began, we see that there are changes in some of those frontal areas that I showed you in the previous slide. This is work done by Anne Bailey, who is another one who moved to Toronto, working in Virginia Penhune's lab. And not only is there a change in the cortical structure, but also that cortical structure allows you to perform more synchronously. So when the musicians are playing together, they're better able to tap in synchrony or move in synchrony if they had that earlier training. So some of those phenomena that Laurel was talking about, the degree of extreme precision that's necessary when they play, which you can hear, is really much easier to achieve if you begin training early. It's not impossible to achieve if you begin later, but it is more difficult. Okay, so that is a lot about the performance aspect, and I want to move to a different feature that involves some of the same brain systems, and that is the ability to imagine music, musical imagery. It's the ability that we have to imagine the sounds of music. And I've put Beethoven here because in a little while at the end of the evening, we're going to hear the trio perform the Archduke Trio. And this is actually some of Beethoven's sketches for that piece. And that piece was composed around 1811. And we know that Beethoven was already quite deaf by then, because in 1802, he wrote his famous Heiligenstadt Testament, basically a long letter where he pours out his heart about the fact that he's going deaf, and he is even considering suicide because it's so difficult for him to consider this. And yet he persevered. And what's remarkable, of course, is that even at a point in his life when he was really quite completely deaf, and there's very good documentation of this, he was able to compose magnificent music, which means that he must have been able to imagine it extremely clearly and well to be able to write it down. So that's really quite remarkable. Now, how do we study that in the lab? Well, we have different sorts of approaches, but one of the approaches that we've used, we're going to try to simulate here in the concert hall. So what's going to happen now is the following. The musicians are going to play an extremely well-known tune that you will recognize instantly, but they won't play the whole thing. They'll play about the first half or so, and then they'll stop. Your job is, as soon as they stop, you have to imagine the rest of the tune as it would normally play out in the appropriate rhythm and so forth. You really need to just imagine that sound in your mind's ear. And when you get to the end of the song, okay, at the very end, when your imagination has stopped, then you press your clicker. Got that? Okay? So the musicians will play, they'll stop halfway through, and then you continue in your mind, and then you click when you get to the very end, and then we're going to see when the clicking is happening. Please. Okay, some of you were asleep. Maybe that's it. You were supposed to actually stop. You weren't meant to keep singing, because it is kind of, you can. If there's anyone that can't get out of it, you know. So the idea here is that hopefully most of you experience the ability to imagine the continuation of that song. And what happens in our experiments is that we actually scan the brain during that silent period when people are imagining something like that, when there's no actual sound, but they're trying to recreate the sound in their mind. And when we look at the brain activity associated with that, we see the following. So in the, here's the lateral view of the brain again. In the orange is the auditory cortex, which is active when people are listening to real sound. That's the control condition when they hear the actual music. And then during the silent period, some of those same regions are active. So in the green regions, we see parts of the brain that are active both for the real music and in silence when you're imagining the music. So portions of the auditory cortex, which respond to real sound, also respond to internal sound, which is really pretty amazing because there's no actual sound there, and yet those neurons are active. In addition, some of the same regions we saw before, in particular here, the dorsal premotor cortex, that's typically very much recruited during these kinds of tasks because imagination is an active task. It actually requires, we think, a motoric component as well as a perceptual component. And so this circuitry that we're talking about is really interesting because it is able to be put to work not only for decoding external stimuli, but also for internal recreation of previously experienced information. There's another feature that I want to point out of this auditory frontal network, and this relates to some of the things that Laurel mentioned, which is the ability to anticipate events. So Laurel mentioned it primarily in the context of rhythmic events, anticipating when something will happen, but it's also possible to anticipate the nature of the event. So for example, in this study carried out by Mark Schönwiesner, what we see is that both auditory and frontal cortex respond to a deviation from what's expected. In this sort of experiment, you hear a sequence of tones, and then at some point, a tone is presented that was not one of the one of the ones in the sequence previously presented, and so therefore it's a deviation from the regular expected pattern. And the nervous system in general is very sensitive to deviations from regularity. The important point here is that you can't respond to a deviation if you don't have a model of what it is that's going to come. In other words, you have an expectation, you have a prediction of what's going to come, and then what does come differs from what was expected, and that's the deviation. If you have no capacity to generate that prediction, you won't notice anything that's deviant, right? So we're going to come back to that topic in the context of emotion in a couple of minutes. So I've been telling you about the circuits which start in the auditory cortex, and of course the auditory cortex is responsible for our ability to perceive sound and our ability to perceive relationships of sound, rhythms and harmonies and tonal patterns and musical intervals and so on and so forth. And I've also talked to you about these pathways that go from the auditory cortex into other parts of the brain and actually feed back eventually back to the auditory cortex. And these loops, so-called, are important not only for sound, but also are enhanced by training and are necessary for the production of music. So there's a very nice parallel between production and perception. As well, I've illustrated evidence that some of these same circuits are important to enable our ability to imagine sounds, and that these systems are highly sensitive to regularities and therefore are able to generate expectancies. But what does all that have to do with pleasure? Because I promised you in the title, at least, that I was going to tell you something about pleasure. And we've already heard about emotion in music. And pleasure, I would argue, is a very significant aspect of the emotional impact that one gets from music. In fact, one of the ways that we look at this is by measuring when people experience a strong, pleasurable response to music so that they get chills or sort of shivers down the spine. How many of you have experienced that this evening? There's quite a few of you. I'm sure maybe when Julie hit that high note, that was one moment. For me, I think it was during Otoño Porteño, and that's possibly because I'm from Argentina, so I have a strong connection to that music. So when we talk about pleasure, we're actually talking about a very different system than this cortical system. We're actually talking about a system deep in the brain. So in this illustration here, there's a cutout, and you're seeing some of these deep structures, basal ganglia. And it's actually a very complex system. Again, I emphasize these are highly oversimplified sort of diagrams. There's a lot of other structures in the medial frontal lobe and also in brainstem nuclei. But one of the most important components of this system is the so-called striatum, which actually consists of two subparts, which I'll get back to in a moment. And these structures are interesting because, first of all, they're phylogenetically very ancient in the sense that if you look in the brain of a salamander, you will see that they also have a striatum, similar in structure to ours. And furthermore, these systems tend to be important for what biologists have called stimuli or events that are essential for survival of some sort. So for example, they would respond to a food reward. So if you take a lab rat and you feed it a certain amount of food, areas in the striatum will respond because it's a pleasurable sensation. Similarly, these regions have been shown to respond to sexual stimulation. And both food and sex are obviously essential for survival. Food for the survival of the individual. Sex is obviously necessary for the survival of the species, because without reproduction, you wouldn't have the species. And it's also been shown that this same system responds to certain kinds of drugs like amphetamines, cocaine, alcohol. And these drugs are indeed part of the reason they're so powerful and dangerous is because they have a direct chemical action on this system. So a few years ago, we were wondering about music and why it gives pleasure. And we know from a vast amount of literature that this is the system that is associated with strong pleasure. And so we wondered, could it be that music would engage the same system? Because after all, music is nothing like any of these other stimuli. It's not a substance, it doesn't have a direct chemical effect, and strictly speaking, it's not even really necessary for survival. You might be miserable without it, but you wouldn't be dead without it, right? So we've done a series of experiments that show that indeed it is the case that this area of the striatum is active, is responding to very strong musical pleasure. And we've done it in a number of ways using a number of different techniques. These are all sort of vertical cuts through the brain like this. And you see the activity in these deep structures, ventral striatum here, and also here with different measures. In the older studies, we did it with just looking at cerebral blood flow. In more recent studies, we're able to look at dopamine, which is important because dopamine is a neurotransmitter. And it is the neurotransmitter that is most important in signaling reward. In many of those animal studies that I mentioned, that's the sort of molecular signal that there is a strong salient and pleasurable stimulus there. And I'll come back to this third study in just a second. But in this one, which was carried out by Valerie Salampur, one of my former PhD students, we noticed something, which is that there were actually sort of two blobs. You can probably see there's one more in the upper part of the brain, the dorsal striatum, and one in the more ventral region. And we wondered why there were those two responses. And so with a little bit of careful analysis, Valerie was able to demonstrate that there's two separate phases of the response. So one of them is in the dorsal striatum, and one of them is in the ventral striatum, and they're divided according to the moment of the peak pleasure. So in these experiments, we have people listen to music that they themselves have selected as chill-inducing. So this is not hard to do. People have lots of recordings that they say, every time I hear this passage, there's a particular spot, and oh my God, it's just wonderful. And when that happens, they indicate to us that it's happened by pressing a button. We can also measure physiological responses like heart rate and so on. And what happens in the brain is really quite interesting because in the moments prior to that peak pleasure, there is a response here in the light blue line in the dorsal striatum, which is this area. And then at the moment of peak pleasure, it goes down, whereas the ventral striatum, which is down here, is slightly active during that time. But then immediately when the peak pleasure moment arises, that's when it really strongly shoots up. And so this means that there are actually two different things going on. One is the actual experience of that pleasure, when you really feel that chill. But another, and I think extremely important one, is this anticipatory phase. And this is, I think, again, related to some of the ideas that Laurel told us about. Now, we're going to try to do a little experiment here. And probably, if there's an ethicist in the audience, I'll be in trouble because I haven't gotten informed consent from you. However, we're going to try it anyway. And the idea here is that I'm trying to have you understand this idea of anticipating and then receiving the element or the stimulus that you expect based on what came before it. So our trio has kindly agreed to play the same segment of music with three different endings, okay? And what I want you to do is very simple. You're going to hear each of these three, and I want you to, at the end, after you've heard all of them, so just hold off until you've heard everything. At the end, I want you to vote for the one that you found most pleasurable. So it'll be same piece of music, three different endings, and at the end, I want you to use your clicker and decide if it's number 1, number 2, or number 3. Now, number 2. And now, no laughing, this is an experiment. Now, number 3, please. Okay, now you get to vote. Which of those three did you find most pleasurable? Vote for number 1, or for number 2, or for number 3. And in a couple of seconds, we'll be ready to display the response. Are we ready? Okay, so that's very interesting. The experiments don't always work. I think I just lost a beer over this. So the first one was actually the conventional ending, which is to say it's the most predictable and standard one. The second one was slightly non-conventional, but actually still within kind of a tonal structure. And the third one was completely unpredictable, essentially random set of notes that had no relationship to what came before. So at the very least, most of you, except for a few recalcitrant people, and maybe you need to come to the lab later to, we'll check out your auditory cortex. So what's interesting here is I think that this whole idea of predictability is obviously playing an extremely important role, because you obviously preferred the one that had the highest predictability, which means that you were able, based on the first set of notes, to anticipate that that ending should have a certain sound, right? So if you hadn't been able to do that, you wouldn't have shown any particular preference. And I think in the context of music, both the performance of it and the composition of it, musicians know this. Musicians understand the idea of playing around with the tension and the resolution that's afforded by our ability to have these expectancies that are either met, that are fulfilled, or that are not fulfilled. And there's some famous music theorists, in fact, who've developed models about this. So if we come back to the brain for a moment, there's another aspect of musical pleasure that we haven't entirely talked about. So up until now, we've talked about this sort of strong experience of chills and pleasure, but most of our experience when listening to music doesn't necessarily involve such strong pleasure. Sometimes it does, and then it's particularly wonderful. But oftentimes we listen to music and we just value it, we enjoy it, we like it, but it doesn't necessarily produce such a strong response. And we wondered whether the same neural system is involved in that sort of experience, as opposed to the very strong sort of physiological alteration that you get with chills. And so in this experiment, again, Valerie Salimpour was the student who did the project, and she came up with the idea that we could essentially use iTunes as our model. So what do we mean? Well, in iTunes, you get to listen to an excerpt of music, and then you decide whether you want to download it or not, and you have to spend a certain amount of money to download it, right? So what we did is we put people in the scanner, and we had them listen to pieces of music. In fact, these are new pieces of music they had never heard before, but they were in a genre that we were pretty confident that they would probably like, at least some of them. And then they had to give a dollar rating as to how much money they'd be willing to spend for that piece of music. And then what we did is we looked in the whole brain, and we used the dollar amount to investigate which regions are changing their activity depending on how much value is assigned, the value being the monetary amount. And what we see is that that same region that I had shown you before, that we saw in the, let me just back up here, that we saw in the other experiments. So it's the ventral striatum, similarly to here, similarly to there. So in that case, we see that this system is not only responsible for pleasure itself, but also responsible for the value that we assign to music. And then we took one additional step, and for this aspect of the project, we got help from Randy McIntosh here from the Rotman. who has some very interesting ways of analyzing the relationship between activity in one part of the brain and in another part of the brain by looking at the coupling between them. So it's sort of similar to what Laurel was talking about. We're looking at how the fluctuations in brain activity, are they synchronized or are they not synchronized? And if they're synchronized, it must be because those parts of the brain are somehow interacting. And so when we looked to see what other parts of the brain were active with the striatum, we saw the auditory cortex, which is shown here in a coronal section. So what this is telling us is that the auditory parts of the brain are interacting with the reward parts of the brain more and more as the value increases. So when you really like something and you're enjoying it and you want to buy it in this particular experiment, then there's a lot of communication between those two systems compared to when you are not so enthralled by it and therefore aren't willing to spend money on it. And I think this finding is really quite important and kind of ties together a lot of the themes that I've talked about tonight, because I've shown you earlier evidence that this cortical circuit that's on the surface of the brain, that's the most highly evolved part of the human brain, and that's the area, those are the systems that are important for perceiving music, performing music, and also for making these predictions, right? For the anticipation that allows us to decide whether the end or the continuation of something is what we expected or not. And that system is coupled with the most phylogenetically ancient system, which is the reward system, which is key to our emotions. And the idea that we're sort of working on at the moment is that this interaction is really the reason why music has such power. In other words, it's bringing together the most highly evolved parts of our brains that do pattern recognition, analysis of sounds that are coming in, predicting what's going to happen next, with the most sort of strongly emotional parts of the brain that have to do with the experience of pleasure. And that is probably why music and perhaps other aesthetic experiences are so powerful and why they're so universal in our species. And so I want to leave you with that idea, and just be sure I thank all of the many people who've contributed to this work, all of my colleagues, some of whom are here this evening, all of the students, none of whom are here because they're busy working in the lab. And again, a special thanks to CIFAR and the Israeli Foundation for putting on this whole show, and to the funding agencies that have been generous with their support. Thank you so much.
For the final segment of your evening, music that intrigues us, the Griffin Trio has teamed up with digital artist Jacques Collin and McMaster's Live Lab to give you a window into your mind as it is responding to music. The trio will play the first movement from Beethoven's Archduke Trio, while Jacques provides a creative representation of brainwaves. Ahead of time, at the Live Lab, the EEG data was captured while a subject was listening to the exact piece that you will hear. So as you are listening to the music, you will see the power spectrum of waves taken from the frontal channels where auditory and cognitive processes are the strongest. When the brain signals emerge, the wavy curve at the bottom of the image will show the signals that were recorded at that precise moment in the music. As that signal moves out in time, we can see overall color patterns, perhaps reflecting the changing emotion of the piece. But most importantly, sit back, enjoy the piece of music, and consider what activity the music might be stimulating in your own brain. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us tonight, and thank you to the Azrieli Foundation and to CIFAR for organizing this evening and making it possible. And let me please remind you to return your clickers as you leave the auditorium. And please enjoy this final performance.
Oh.